to the longest running symposium in the nation, 56th Annual Edward Martin Design Symposium. I wonder what it takes to have the longest running symposium in the nation. I was trying to find a way to have a break the ice joke. Yesterday I attended a summit, agriculture summit. I heard something, I'm stealing it. It goes something like this. On a beautiful day just like this, a golfer takes time to smell the roses and goes out for a round of golf. At his first tee, after practicing his swing several times very carefully, aims for the ball, takes a shot, and misses it. Of course, ball goes only a few feet away and lands on the top of Ant Hill Mound. After his cussing is over, takes another careful aim, takes the shot, misses again. With his shot, instead of ball, it takes half of the anthill. After more grumbling, takes one more shot. And guess what? Misses the ball again. And with all those swings, every time he takes half of the anthill, kills most of the ant. At the end, only 2 ants remains alive. And one says the other, you want to stay alive? Get on with the ball. I think the success of running the longest symposium, our leaders been with the ball. Year in, year out, they identify the topics, they identify the speakers, and brought them here. Brought them so that you fill the auditorium. Over the years, we have many distinguished speakers. I asked my able assistant Debbie to give me the list of the speakers since I've been the department head. And here are the names. 2007, Dr. Neil G. Odomwald from Louisiana, Plato Clotos from Memphis, Saad Cartouche. Oh, I must have snuck in. 2008, we convinced Edward Martin, the founder, to make an appearance, and along with Bob gave a nice presentation. 2009, Jim Del Prince enchanted the audience with beautiful flower arrangements, along with Gail Barton about the natural plants and wildflowers, and Bob made an appearance again. And last year, we had distinguished Jim Cochran from Atlanta area showing historic gardens in Charleston, along with our faculty member, Michael Seymour. These year's speakers definitely enhance and add to this list. As you have already known, this year's symposium will focus on how landscapes best fit their environment. This is perfect with being with the ball. First presentation entitled Landscapes in a Different Light by Associate Professor Robert Brzuszek, my department. Bob will present photos of Mississippi gardens and discuss how images best reflect the places in which people live. Followed by Dr. Tim Schauwecker, brand new associate professor, I must add, also from my department. And he's also the co-editor of Blackbelt Prairies of the Coastal Plain. Will present project that weave ecology plans in the gardens to reflect local landscapes. And finally, our featured speaker, Carol Franklin, Fellow of American Society of Landscape Architects, a founding principal of Andropogan Associates in Philadelphia, will present a presentation entitled The Spirit of the Place. Carol Franklin is an internationally known landscape architect with more than 40 years of experience in designing nationally award-winning gardens. She has lectured around the world about American traditions of art, landscape, and architecture, and in her presentation she will provide examples of sustainable landscapes. Among practicing her trade as a landscape architect, she's been also very busy. I don't know how she finds time. She is also the author, co-author of an award-winning, brand new, honor award-winning publication entitled Metropolitan Paradise, 4-volume book. I will keep this outside for you to kind of take a look. Any of you interested, she may have a way to get you those. Now it's time for recognitions and thanks. Obviously, the list is long, and as it goes, every time you thank somebody, you end up forgetting somebody, but I like to live dangerously. I would like to thank our speakers for taking time from their very busy schedules to share knowledge and expertise with us. I would like to thank Mississippi Garden Clubs and its leadership for their support and presence. Without your support and presence, we will not be. Each and every one of you as participants sponsoring this symposium with your registration and attendance. At the end of my remarks, I'm going to call current chapter president, Ms. Linda Moore, to make some few remarks. And before I turn over the podium to Bob, I would like to introduce a colleague of mine. Is Mike Phillips here yet? He will eventually. The reason I wanted to introduce, he is the new head of plants and soil sciences. And as you know, we work very closely as the garden clubs. I made a special point of inviting him. He is busy, but he's going to make an appearance, and when he does, we will introduce him. I would like to also recognize two very special people. Without their contribution and dedication, this symposium will not be. And one is Bob, who took over the position of leader and facilitator for this symposium after Ed Martin. And I don't think we missed a bit. Although we missed Ed's colorful character versus dull Bob, I also like to recognize Miss Debbie Whitfield, that's been busy as a bee, registering everybody, making sure that everything is done and ready for us. Finally, remember 4-5 years ago, I gave everybody an assignment. I said, we need students, we need you to recruit. We're not getting anybody. The bad news is, when the economy goes bad, enrollment goes down. Our enrollment never been this bad. It's not something that we're not doing. All the schools in landscape architecture in this shape. Right, currently #1 program, University of Georgia, down 36%. We're down. We're not that bad, but we're down. And people in the top of the hill, President Provost, has started to pull my ears. And I don't like pain. If I feel pain, you're going to feel the pain. So can I count on each and every one of you recruiting? Yes. I cannot hear you. Yes. Nah, that's more like it. Okay. Then, may I ask Ms. Linda Moore to come to the podium and share some remarks. Again, welcome to Mississippi State.
Rather than Linda, but that's okay. I'll go by Linda.
I'm so sorry.
That's okay. Because you know how I pronounce your name, so that's okay.
Yeah, very well.
So, good morning, and I would like to take this opportunity to thank you people for helping us so much in the Garden Clubs of Mississippi, for all the opportunities you give us, and making this the longest symposium in the United States. The Edward C. Martin Landscape Design Symposium. We are looking forward to the program today. As I sat with Carol and last night, I was very impressed with all the things that she was talking about, and so I'm really looking forward to her today, and of course Bob and Tim. So I would just like to say thank you from the Garden Clubs of Mississippi for allowing us to be a part of this.
it's really great to see our good friends here who have traveled from around the state to be with us today. So as usual, it's really a good time to be with you all. And I have to put my binoculars on these days. But yeah, this is the 56th annual Edward C. Martin Landscape Symposium. And I had a question earlier today. This is already starting to happen. Who was Ed Martin? Was what I was asked. So we have students here, we have people who are new here to the symposium. So I just want to mention who Mr. Martin is. He was a professor emeritus of Mississippi State University, and he began this event in 1955. That was before I was born, not by much, to bring landscape design to the general public. And there were at that time, as there still are now, few forums like this that are in the state concerning landscape architecture. And Ed helped to develop landscape architecture here in the state of Mississippi. He began the landscape architecture program originating in horticulture and taught the first classes. He helped to begin our state professional chapter of ASLA. And I won't say that Ed is now advanced in age, but his landscape architecture license is #1, and rightfully so. Ed could not be with us this year. He doesn't travel as well anymore, but he did send his regards to you all. And recently, Gwen Sisson is a writer, and she wrote a nice article about Ed and the Landscape Symposium, and they ran this photo that was in the paper. And this was from the 50th symposium when Ed retired. And after someone sent him the article, he wrote a rather lengthy email where he said, this is, and I quote from his email, he said, "On seeing that photo back then, I never realized what a long nose I had. It is amazing that some of you long ago didn't nickname me the Beak. And maybe you did, and rightfully so." But anyway, Ed is doing very well. He's currently finishing his book on Biltmore Estates, and he just retired from serving as a tour guide of the grounds since he's been up there. But he does send his regards to you all. Well, this year's symposium is about place. And it's the places we live, the places we work, the communities we live in, and the places that we garden. And places are unique to themselves. They only occur in one location, one spot on the earth, and nowhere else. And for example, when I say that I'm going to Las Vegas, or I'm going to New Orleans, or I'm going to New York, there's no question of where I'm going. These are places we have either visited or seen or at least heard of, and we know that these places are special. And I became fascinated with the idea of place when I first moved to the South. I know from my accent, it's hard for you to believe I didn't grow up here in Mississippi. I grew up in the South, though. I grew up in southern Michigan. Roseville, Michigan, to be exact, which is just a suburb just outside of Detroit. And this is kind of what the houses look like there. It's a very dense urban bedroom community for the city of Detroit. The population of greater Detroit at that time was around 5 million people. Okay? Lots of people around. And all the streets were in straight grid lines. Brzuszek lived in just outside Detroit as well. But my hometown was built like many suburbs for people that were working in the city in the auto plants. And this was affordable housing for workers there. And so my family lived here, worked for Chrysler, GM, and some of the different auto plants. And my people are not known for their exuberant lifestyles. There are not a lot of fancy houses or extensive gardens. And even with a name like Roseville, I don't remember many roses in people's houses, in their yards. But a lot of the people that moved here, like my family, were immigrants from Eastern Europe. They came to work at the industry, a lot of Germans, Czechs, Poles, such as my family. And they're very practical people living very practical lives. So it's a very nondescript community. Maybe that's where my personality comes from. Sadek mentioned earlier.
Bingo!
But by no means was it boring, Sadek.
I beg the difference.
I had a bunch of Polish relatives, and we could polka as well.
I haven't seen you polka.
Yeah. So, when I was old enough to actually realize that that there wasn't 6 feet of snow for 6 months, I moved to South Louisiana, where it was a little bit warmer. It was a big change. It was a mysterious place full of water, bayous. It was a place of glorious food, and I learned how to eat, maybe not so much cook, but learned how to eat there. And Cajun music, which reminded me of polka music a lot, because they both use accordions. Okay? So, really had a good time while I was there. But imagine my surprise of when I had a chance to move to South Mississippi. I said I would try living in Mississippi for a year, and that was 21 years ago. And actually before that, Mr. Robert Port, who's sitting right up front here, a landscape architect in the Jackson area, brought me to Mississippi for the first time, and I worked for him for a summer. If you remember that, Robert, or maybe you're trying to forget that summer. But I've never lived in a town, seriously, I've never lived in a town of less than 200,000 people before. And suddenly I was plunked down in the middle of a pasture in Flora, Mississippi. I had to walk about a mile down a 2-lane road to get a Coke. And God forbid at that time if I should call it a pop or a soda, because I would have been run out of the state. But even the simple act of buying a Coke took about 45 minutes, because the clerk behind the counter never saw somebody from Michigan before. So I had to give my whole life spiel about why I was there, and it wasn't her fault. She didn't have much else to do in Florida, Mississippi. But one thing about living in Mississippi has forced me to slow down. Okay? Slow down and look around me at the important things. And it pushed me off the main road and made me walk down the dirt road. And I saw things that were much, much clearer then. Because along the dirt road, I began to notice what was blooming beneath the wire fences. And I could tell what part of the country, I know we have some geologists in the audience today, what part of the country that I was walking in by the color of the dirt on my shoes. Because down by the Pearl River, it was a silty gray color that were on my shoes because of all the silts from the river bottoms. And as I walked up the bank, the dust on my shoes would turn to a red, kind of a brick red color, because of the red clay. And here in North Starkville, where I live, when I walk down the road, my shoes turn a chalky white. So I always know where I am by the color of my shoes. And sometimes when I'm walking down the road, I know Brian often sees me walking by sometimes. He lives not too far from me. But sometimes people will actually stop and ask if I need a ride. And I have to tell them, no, I'm just actually walking down the road. But in case you don't know it, it's not like that in too many places. Because here, people care. People care about how you feel and to make sure your car didn't break down somewhere along the road. But people have asked me why, and with good question, why I stay in Mississippi. And the question usually comes from, interestingly enough, people who live here. And I don't think it's because they're asking me to leave. I don't think. They just want to know how a Detroit boy could live here, and why not the bright lights in the big city. And I've lived in the bright lights, and I've done the big city, and I do go back and visit them occasionally. But the truth is, I stay here because it's home. I feel more at home here in Mississippi than anywhere else I've ever lived. And a lot of it is because of the land here. It's the pine trees. I've never seen so much land in one place, in one stretch. I've never seen as much unparalleled beauty as we have here in Mississippi. And when Janice Ray writes in her book, Ecology of a Cracker Childhood, If you've never read that book, it's a wonderful, wonderful book on the piney woods. But she wrote, I drink in the longleaf pine forest like water. And I get it, okay? I drink it in too. I know what that feels like. I feel at home with the atmosphere here, the light. It changes constantly and gives a new way of looking at things, the same landscape in different ways. And I've been in foggy landscapes on the Gulf Coast where you would swear the Gulf of Mexico came ashore. It just feels so dense. And the landscape forms at that time all merged together into one mass. And I think one of my favorite openings from a book that describes the atmosphere on the Gulf Coast starts out saying, I stepped off the plane in New Orleans and the air hit me like a wet sock. That's exactly what it does. Or sometimes in the evenings, when everything appears in silhouette and the colors wash away, but the forms become very crisp and sharp. I've seen millions and millions of different ground patterns and textures, bark, and grasses, and branches, and there's so much detail as one walks by and looks at closely. And Tom Wood wrote that people develop a sense of place when you can feel the sun on your face or the rain on your back, the smooth and rough textures of the land, the color of the sky at morning and sunset, the fragrance of the plants blooming in season, the song and antics of birds and the cautious ramblings of mammals. Those are the environmental influences that define place. And environment is one thing we have more than anything else of in Mississippi. It's the land, it's the character of the land, and that's what creates a place for us. And I love Mississippi for its history, I really do, because I think it runs so deep. And there are so many untold stories that are in our landscapes. You walk down a road and you see this and you say, where do those steps go to? Why are they there? What was once there at one time? Or something like an old barn. Where else in Mississippi would you see something where you're wondering, what was it like to work in there? What did people do in that place? Why was it abandoned? What happened? What is the story behind this place? And I love our idiosyncrasies. Where else but Mississippi would you see someone paint parking stripes on a gravel parking lot? Only in Mississippi, nowhere else. In signs, I love the signs that we make here. If you want to tell somebody something, just stick a sign on it. Just up the street from where I live, not far from Brian's house. This sign was actually out front in a mailbox. And the thing I love about it is they're so gracious, they ask, please. You know, things like this. You don't want people to park out front, you stick a sign out there. I do love this one. It's just outside of a thrift store. And it says on the bottom, what part of thou shalt not steal do you not understand? So it's a little biblical reference from in there. I love the stuff we stick in our yards. And that's one thing I learned about landscapes in Mississippi is you have to have a focal point. It's got to be somewhere. And you know, sometimes we're not quite sure what these are. This is, for some reason, Easter eggs and patriotism combined together. Here's another one combining both holidays of Easter and Christmas. And people are not afraid to express themselves here. This is actually, if you go on Highway 9, just outside Eupora, and you head north toward Oxford, you will see this. And It's fascinating. This is Miss Sally's house, and she has concrete figures of just about every type. And I'm sure you've seen it as you've driven by. And I've actually stopped, and this is Miss Sally right here. We stopped and chatted and had a lovely conversation about what's going on there. And I have to fess up, she's from Ohio. She's not from here. But she loves this place, and she loves, you know, expressing what she has. And if you notice, all the legs are buried in concrete. And that's because people kept stealing these things from the front of the yard. So she took care of that real quick. But it's not just Mississippi. Here's Louisiana. In a small town not too far from New Iberia, Lafayette area. And if you can imagine mowing and weed eating around all of these things. But sticking stuff in the yard is a Mississippi tradition. It's a cultural pattern. Even Felder Rushing has all his little tchotchkes around the front of his house, as well as Ed Blake's home patio. And the concrete chicken that you see here right in front is there for Ed Martin, because Ed Martin used to make fun of, how many students do we have, landscape architecture students here? We've got a few. At that time, Professor Martin would say, well, it just looks like it just needs to have a concrete chicken out front. So this was Ed Blake's homage to Ed Martin in his yard. But I'm really not making fun of this. I think this is, to me, it's mesmerizing. Number one, that people would care this much to put and arrange these things, these personal things around their home. And I think it's very appreciated. We have a lot of place in Mississippi. We have world-class artists that are known internationally for their work of place and environment, incorporating environment to their characters and stories. You can look at the writings of Welty and Faulkner, and you can taste the landscape in the stories that they paint. And I believe that Mississippi, as Lyle Watson mentions here, is that we didn't come into this world, we came out of this world, born into this landscape, into a place. That's what makes it happen. And as designers, I think it's very important to understand what place is, where it comes from. Because when I see people like doing stuff like this around here, okay, importing some new design style because they saw it on HGTV, or they maybe saw it in a magazine somewhere and thought it might look good in their backyard. It's not that there's anything wrong with it, but one thing is it doesn't seem like it belongs to place, to where we are here. And I mention this because probably more than we've seen in the past here, certainly in my 21 years, I've seen more changes of places that just don't look like they came from the South. I see subdivisions like this. Walker Percy once wrote that there are more Cleveland, Ohio-like subdivisions in Nashville and Atlanta than there are in Cleveland. And I see that happening here in Starkville. I see it happening in Flowood. I see it happening in Oxford. And this is an erosion of place. Not as much as we used to have. Because Mississippi is supposed to have front porches. And they have to have them big enough to be able to sit down and talk. That's the purpose of it. And our homes become records. They're records of who lived here before, what happened, what that story is, what was going on. Okay, we are at the nation's best at recycling that I've ever seen anywhere else. This is a shipping pallet turned into a bike rack. Okay, that's cool. That's cool stuff. One thing I learned about Mississippi is that if the world's doing something one way, okay, we're going to figure out another way to do it. It's always been like that. And to me, here's what matters. Okay? You and me here now. We are here doing our stuff, doing our thing, living our life. And hopefully we're expressing that into our landscapes, as it should be. And when I talk about place, being an academic, the definition of place, supposedly, is a place, some place or a space that means something to somebody. And if it doesn't have meaning, it's supposed to mean a space, an open spot, empty, an open lot waiting for something to happen. And with all due respect to the academics, I don't believe that so much. I don't buy it, because I think all places do have meaning. I think they all have past histories. Whatever this place was before it was abandoned was an important place. Native Americans lived there, your grandparents lived there, something happened somewhere, and that doesn't go away, because I think that ghost still occurs in the landscapes that we inhabit. And I think that's important to distinguish place. So, and I think Carol Franklin, as she speaks later, I had a chance to read her wonderful new book, which I highly encourage. Yeah, this right here is about place. This is about the importance of these empty spaces, if you will, and what they mean to a community and how important those things are, even in the densest of communities of Philadelphia. Philadelphia, PA, not Mississippi. When I went to Detroit this past summer, for the first time in many years, and I saw many, many areas of the city. Sadek, when was the last time you went out to Detroit? 8 years ago. Okay. It's changed. But this is what my city looks like. It looks like this. It was abandoned, and rightfully so. And on one hand, it was really sad to see this, because I knew the families that lived in these places, and I knew the stories of that land. I knew what it was like. But on the other hand, it also seemed hopeful, because I saw nature coming back in a city that never had nature in it before. I would have loved to have had a patch of brambles or a stand of sumacs like this around the block from where I lived, but I didn't. Okay, I had to walk 2 miles to a railroad track to see ditches in growing along the edge of a railroad track. So I didn't ever walk in the woods until I was 12 years old, and that was because I went and visited my brother in Massachusetts. Okay? So on one hand, I see this as a great opportunity, and this is a good take-home lesson, I do think, for Mississippi, because in other places where as you grow, that we are able to incorporate and keep place, keep the natural environments, keep a remnant of what is special about an environment. I do think that's very important. And there's just 2 simple ways of doing it. 2 simple rules to keep place. 1 is do not lose the best things that you have. And 2, where you don't have great things going on, make that happen. Create the opportunities for that to happen. Those become the shared values of a community. And I know that I'm speaking to the choir here. I know all of you could school me more on Mississippi than I can. But one thing I have found out, sometimes it takes somebody from coming from somewhere else to say, man, what you have here is fantastic. And, I feel that way all the time. There are people here in this room that are creating place. Carol Franklin, Robert Poor, many, many others of you are, in your daily work, are doing that, communicating that in some way. And we need more of that. But the things we have here in Mississippi, sometimes we take for granted. Things that, clean air, good, abundant water resources. Yeah. So many of these natural resources and wonderful things we have are really becoming more rare and precious in this world. And our sense of place, I think, is becoming endangered as part of that. There's something that is called a tyranny of changes, which means that lot by lot, one small change that accrues over time. Turns out to be a big change, and suddenly things don't resemble what they were anymore, and that's very common. We have that happening in many places. You can look at Highway 25 in Flowood, you can look at Highway 12 right here in Starkville, and those are things that we can all have a voice in and make some influence in our communities as we grow, as we should grow, in a way that is respectful and helpful to the communities we have around us. So anyway, thank you very much for all coming out here today. And we have a great morning planned for you. Our next speaker here, as was mentioned, is Dr. Tim Schauwecker, and he is the coordinator for our landscape contracting division of our department. In thinking about this program, I've asked him to talk about a regional landscape. And as I had mentioned earlier, I think the greater landscape is really important to consider about place, defining our place. In Tim's master's and PhD work was in biology. He studied about our local prairies here in this area, in our physiographic region that we are in right here. This edge of Starkville is actually part of the Blackbelt Prairie. So he's going to share with you some thoughts on his landscape in this region. And one of the things I really appreciate about Tim, it's not the only thing, yeah, maybe. But in addition to being a good scientist, he is actually very thoughtful about place and design and how to work with the site's ecology, and it's a pleasure for me to work alongside him. He teaches me a lot, and we're very, very lucky to have him here. So please give a warm welcome to Dr. Tim Schauwecker.
He made me eat my words. I think he's going to audition for a new show after Jay Reno retires. Again.
I had to apologize to Bob as I was walking in. I had class this morning and didn't get over here in time to load my talk, which was a bad move on my part. But I'm gonna pick up almost right where Bob left off, which I think is hopefully appropriate. And I'm going to try to stand behind this podium, because if I don't, I'm going to rip all the guts out of this computer, and that would probably not be a good thing. But I tend to move around a lot, usually when I'm talking, and so if I do rip the guts out, you just have to bear with me while I hook it all back up again. I have had the pleasure of working in, excuse me, in prairie ecosystems for a long time. There are a number of other researchers who have done probably far more than me, for sure. But it is also my connection to Mississippi. And that is something that, as a landscape contractor, I try to bring to my students and to the table, is the ability to take the things that we are seeing in nature and bring them either into our yards, or to be able to manage them in the landscape so that we can go out and enjoy them in their natural state. And so I'm going to talk today about gardening with your ecological heritage in mind, which is largely about preserving space and preserving the spaces that gave rise to our culture. And so, first we have to start a little bit back at the beginning of the term. So if I talk about ecological heritage, we have to first understand what is ecology. And ecology is the study of ecosystems. And so then, what is an ecosystem? An ecosystem is any biological environment consisting of all living and non-living things. This largely is the problem with the study of ecology. Can we ever understand all of the interactions between all the living and non-living entities in our environment? I don't think that we necessarily can. which is part of the beauty of place. So the entirety of these interactions occur within what we call a watershed. Watersheds lead to the oceans. All of these things are found on our planet, and even outside of our planet. The solar system affects things that go on our planet. So we have, for example, the moon affecting what goes on with our tides. Okay, so it's this interconnectedness of big things and small things, and basically there being no way to disconnect these things. They're inextricably linked, and we are a part of that linkage, fitting somewhere in that continuum. And so if we look at examples of what are these living and non-living things that we are trying to understand, all of the living components, animals, plants, fungi, even the small things in the soil bacteria, that really our life depends upon. We cannot separate ourselves from all of these living things, our connections to all of these living things, as well as our connections to many of the non-living things. We depend on soil resources. We depend on water resources. We react every day to weather. We are essentially dependent entirely on sunlight energy for everything that we do every day. Air and fire, then too, are other components that we have to pay attention to. In studying prairies, fire is one of the most important components that makes a prairie a prairie. But it's also, when's the last time anybody saw a good prairie fire? Even for me, it's been a number of years. So this is something that we probably should embrace more, are these non-living entities and bringing them into our living environment. And then heritage, which is the cultural, social, and spiritual legacy that we inherit from our past and pass on to the future. This is the essence of place. The things that came before us, the things that we're going to then leave for other people. And also, this respect for all of those things, and trying to keep those things together as the core of our existence, and the core of our ecological heritage. So, the things that I'm going to talk about today have to do with prairie, and the idea of preserving prairie, and also bringing prairie onto your properties, or preserving prairie that might be nearby your property. Now, if you're not from a prairie town, like West Point or Prairie, Mississippi, or Starkville, Columbus, and you're from someplace else, from another physiographic region, the things that I'm going to talk about today apply to you, and the methods that I'm going to talk about today apply to you as well. There's no separation between of you and your local plants, the plants that were there before even your forebears lived there. The process and the thought processes are pretty much the same as what I'm going to talk about for prairies. So prairies were distributed across the southeastern United States. These are just the ones that we have in Mississippi. You see the northeastern prairie belt and the Jackson prairie belt. There are prairies in southern Arkansas, also with similar characteristics. There are prairies in eastern Texas, and obviously in Alabama. There are cedar glades that I'm going to talk about in just a little bit in central Tennessee that are also similar to our prairies and have many similar biological characteristics as well as physical characteristics. So this is, we're pulled back from place here because we're sort of at a scale beyond what is local. We're at a regional scale when we're talking about physiographic regions, the plants that are typical to where you come from. So we're gonna then continue to zoom in a little bit in just a second. This is actually a scanned component, and this comes from Toby Gray's thesis, who Toby is here today. And Toby studied the Jackson prairies. And this is, I want to go go back in time a little bit in talking about prairies. And I think that the page that Toby pulled out of for his thesis is a good introduction to what these prairies were sort of like in the 1830s when we first began to move to Mississippi, especially as Europeans and Africans began to move to Mississippi. So this was one of the original surveys from the 1830s, where this particular surveyor is writing down really some of the first descriptions of the prairies that occurred in Mississippi. So along his chain at 2 links, he came into a prairie opening. And this prairie opening, while not described in depth, he knew what prairie was. This surveyor had a good grasp on what it was that he was seeing. He knew that he was walking into a grassland, that it was a natural feature, that it was something that his bosses in Washington would be interested in knowing about, because this prairie, at the time especially, was seen as a resource. This was a soil resource. This was a reason potentially for people to move here, a reason potentially for people to use that particular resource if they so chose. So he came into prairie, he exited prairie, he went into another forest type, which in particular was, in this case, he made his mark on a post oak. You can see that he then also notes that there was pine there, and there was also more post oak and blackjack oak. This is sort of the picture that you can get to, you can start to put a picture together of what this landscape would have looked like. A sort of fire, the trees there accepted fire and were fire adapted was the word that I was looking for. A fire adapted forest that was sparse and with these prairie openings dispersed amongst all of these fire adapted trees like post oak and blackjack oak in the landscape. And then he comes back into prairie, he goes back out of prairie. So there are these series of islands, these series of openings, a sort of savanna-like distribution. So as early as 1830, prairie was important to this region and to really, and this was actually from the Jackson Belt, but a little bit further south in Mississippi. But the prairie descriptions are very similar. Only in the Northeast Prairie Belt, and I'm going to show another map in just a second, the prairies were more widely distributed and probably a little bit larger. And so this is more of what we would have expected to see in terms of the large prairie openings in the northeast part of Mississippi. And so pause for just a moment and ask yourself if you really have seen anything comparable to this in your lifetime. Good. And where did you see it? Anybody who was, where have you seen an extensive grassland of this sort? In Texas, okay. Anybody else?
Wyoming and Montana. Yeah.
Wyoming and Montana, absolutely.
Southeast Colorado.
Southeast Colorado. Anybody been to Konza Prairie in Kansas?
No. Yes.
Okay. Another fantastic example. How about in Mississippi?
Nebraska.
Nebraska, absolutely. Illinois, absolutely. In Mississippi?
Yes. Well, my grandfather's landing strip grew up like that.
Okay.
That's what-
And that's entirely, and that would be a good example of a place where it was able to regenerate. But extensive prairie lands like this essentially are gone in the state of Mississippi. We don't have nearly, we really don't have anything that's nearly as extensive as this. This is a painting, and again, this is Toby. I have to give Toby credit for showing me the work of Philip Juris, because but when I saw this painting, and these are all mine. Philip is an artist in Georgia who was recounting the travels of William Bartram through the southeastern United States. And so this is the prairie that, as interpreted by Philip Juris, that Bartram would have seen in, and I believe this was in the late 1700s. So we had these extensive prairie lands, large swaths of grassland in the northeastern part of the state. But these, and this is an oil painting, by the way, which may surprise. Well, I mean, the realism, especially of the clouds in this painting, I think is absolutely phenomenal. And so Philip, the process that Philip goes through is basically trying to recount, as best I can tell, he recounts Bartram's travels, and he goes to the best remnants of sites that he can find, does character sketches at those sites, and then tries to piece together what these little pieces of prairie, for example, in this case, that are left, and then what the landscape would have looked like, you know, some 200 years ago, 300 years ago, between 200 and 300 years ago. And so this is in, you know, our best sort of description of what's been lost. This is a map showing the distribution of how those prairies would have looked in our region in northeast Mississippi. Now, I've actually studied and sampled some of these at some of these sites. In particular, let's see, I believe Mennonite Church. I knew it as a different name, but that is a small prairie opening to the east of let's see, of Brooksville, the other town, to the east of Macon. Go ahead. Yeah, sure. Turn it on. Turn it on. Check. Okay, there we go. So this is a very small site. North Farm Prairie is actually more of a chalk outcrop now. It's right at the very edge of the mostly cotton fields on the north side of Highway, right at the intersection of Highway 82 and 182. 16 section prairie is also known as Osborne Prairie, which I'm going to refer to a little bit later in giving a plug for the Friends of Osborne Prairie, who can use all the support that you can give them in trying to save some of these places. There's a few more further north, and I'm going to show a picture. So anyway, these are remnants. These are small prairies that are left from what was originally surveyed in the mid-1800s. So you can see the size and extent, especially around Brooksville, on the way to West Point. You know, this is a very large prairie island, prairie opening that was described in the original survey. This is a very large prairie island that was described in the original survey. There are but very small pieces of these left today in terms of intact grassland that you could go out and see. So this is a photograph of one of the best remaining prairie openings, and this one is, I think the total size of this is somewhere between 30 and 40 acres. In recent history, this was considered the best prairie that was left in northeast Mississippi. This is in the Chickasaw Wildlife Management Area north of Tree Block, Mississippi. It is a beautiful site, but it's not really all that big. And now, from what I understand, there's another site nearby that is actually in private ownership that is arguably a better and larger example of prairie, also in that Tree Block area. I haven't seen that one, but if I had a picture of it, I'd show it to you as well. But I have a feeling it looks pretty much a lot like this. Now, this was somewhat discovered as a result of controlled burning that spilled out of nearby forest lands that were being managed as pines. And the forest managers, honestly, I don't know that they necessarily made a decision to manage prairie. It was almost by chance that the fire spilled out of the forest, and this prairie then, you know, really, it was there, but then probably a number of cedars started to drop away with increased fire intensity, and now it is arguably one of the most beautiful places in northeast Mississippi. Robert, do you agree with that?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Robert studied this prairie, as part of a design that he's doing for our site, the Wetland Education Theater. And so this is, even at just that most basic level, a resource for designers, it's a resource for biologists, it's a resource for wildlife, it is a resource on a number of different levels.
Tim,
Go ahead.
back to the slide that has the remnants.
Yeah.
Would those have all been contiguous at one time?
No, I don't think that that was ever the case. It was honestly a series of prairie islands that would have, in my mind, sort of changed shape according to fire patterns, changed shape according to how the water might have moved around or through a site.
It's a big swamp.
It's always shown on a map as a big swath, exactly, but that's not the case. It was grassland islands intermixed with our native forests, all kind of jumbled up in between. If you go back a number of many years, you would have seen that fire might have expanded one of the prairie islands, or the forest might have closed in on one of the prairie islands, and so fire would have dictated probably how large and how extensive, is my take. This is more commonly what we see as prairie today. Everybody's seen these chalk outcrops. Bob showed a slide of a chalk outcrop. We see chalk outcrops mostly on the side of the road, because when we cut a road, we generally will expose parent material, and so we see this is more or less, and the other thing that we see almost always with these chalk outcrops are the cedar trees. And so the cedar trees are growing slowly. They cast shade, and shade is really the enemy of prairie, because prairies are open, sunny places. So as the cedar trees start to close in, we start to lose prairie species. They start to drop out. We have only really the shade-dominant prairie species left. So this is far more common in terms of what our prairies look like today as chalk outcrops. Okay? The culture that arose from this particular natural system gave rise to a number of different things that we hopefully value. Whether it is, for example, the Blues Trail, historic Indian mounds. This was a resource for people that lived here before European settlement. The Prairie Arts Festival today in West Point is another example. Where this is, and these are examples of place. All of these make this place that we are from, or that I'm now from, a place. And so if we look again at the current map, and this is actually a 2004 aerial image, there are two things, there are two features when you look at this, when you pull out the state of Mississippi, that you can see from space. Anybody want to take a stab? You see the delta? Absolutely. You see the river? Absolutely, you see the river. Okay, but what else do you see in this map? If you're just kind of, you see the prairie. Okay, does everybody?
Yeah, I can see it.
Yeah, you can see the piney woods actually, but do you see the prairie?
Yeah.
Okay, and the prairie and the delta dominate these landscapes. Okay, these are both geologically driven. And that geology really becomes a part of the place that you are from. And when you I'm going to get to gardening. Give me just a few more minutes. I'm going to get to gardening. I'm going to tie all this together, I promise. But when you're gardening, and if you're gardening with this heritage in mind, then these are the things that you'll use for inspiration. Okay? These geologic formations, these plant materials that are associated with geologic formations, those become the paints that you'll use. So, continuing to zoom in, I'm going to talk a little bit about my neighborhood in particular. I live right down at the end of the street right here. Let's see. Get my house. I might have zoomed in a little bit too far. Oh no, that's how I know. I live right here. This is my house. Okay, I have a small prairie remnant that I'm restoring right here and in the woods. Okay, this is my neighbor, Miss Betty. Miss Betty, are you here? Miss Betty's here. I try every day to keep Miss Betty from turning into Miss Betty's Felder Russian. That is my goal in life. Is to have Miss Betty not say, "Darn that Felder." Because I know Felder's referred to it on his program many times, that he, you know, he has these interactions with his neighbors, well, I'm not gonna get too far down that path, but Miss Betty, down at the end of my street, you make a left, and you'll come to one prairie remnant right here. And so I'm going to talk just a little bit about that. How do I know it's a prairie remnant? These are the plants that are found there. Okay, this is Indian grass, one of the prairie dominant grasses. This is Aster novae, New England aster. This is Aster ericoides, which is a heath aster. And this is Manfreda virginica, which used to be called agave virginica. It's our native agave. This is what it looks like in bloom. This is actually not from this site. But this is, you know, this little piece of prairie in my neighborhood.
Where do you live?
Pardon me?
Where do you live?
I live in Starkville. I'm sorry, I should have gone back to that. Here, let me put this in context just a little bit.
What is that green something?
This right here, this is a lake. This is a lake right over the.
No.
Oh, go.
It says a road, Greensboro.
Yeah, this is Greensboro Street.
Okay.
Okay, so downtown, if you follow Greensboro Street, you'll hit downtown, and Lampkin Street and Main Street is down here. So I'm on the west end of town. Our neighborhood is called West End.
Well, I just thought you lived in the Starkville area, but there's a Greensboro road over at Eupora, so that was the reason I was saying.
Oh, yeah, sorry about that, and I definitely should have introduced that idea. And so, here down at the end of Greensboro Street, which again, here's old what is called Old 82 or Highway 182. This comes down. There's a new bypass down this way, and so this again. Yeah, at the end of Greensboro Street and Tally Ho, I don't know if you know Starkville that well, but it's basically out the west side of Starkville. And so I've been kind of watching this patch and watching as the cedars have kind of closed in on this patch. This is what it looks like as you look out into that prairie patch. Not particularly distinct. And I would say not particularly what many of us would consider beautiful. Anybody besides me find this beautiful?
It needs to be burned.
It needs to be burned, yes. Yes, it needs to be burned. That is absolutely right. It's being lost as a result of the cedar trees that are starting to close in on this particular patch. And this is happening basically all over the state of Mississippi, where we're losing cedar plants, individual plants, as the cedar trees continue to grow in the absence of fire. So this is kind of what we're working against. Now, I had mentioned this to a few of the neighbors nearby, and one of their responses that I'd love to burn it, essentially is what I said. And you know, they were worried about traffic noise. So if you look at Highway 182, and this is a very real concern. They don't want to be exposed to the traffic noise and seeing the traffic and the danger associated potentially with that traffic. And so this is the balancing act that we, it's the tightrope that we walk every day. What is the prairie remnant worth in exchange for that comfort that comes from not being able to see through that, or not being able to burn, or not burning this, or the potential risk of using fire in the landscape? So we have to deal with these things every day, and it is a balancing act. And so then there's another patch directly across the street. So we were just right here, and now we've come down and moved across. And actually, so that geologic formation basically runs all the way down through here, all the way. Really, there's a ridge that runs behind our house that sort of continues on down along through here, which is why I'm able to have a prairie in my backyard, very small prairie. Go ahead.
The geology, what is it?
The geology is a Cretaceous era it's a Cretaceous formation that would be described as a chalk. It's called the Demopolis chalk. And so that is what underlays all these soils, and that was that formation that you saw when you saw that very white, where we see those soils being exposed, the parent material. It's a chalky material. So this is what that particular prairie looks like. This is again heath aster and Grindelia lanceolata, and there are a number of other species in there, but those two just happen to be in bloom at the time. So if we look at some of those, here again is the heath aster. This is Solidago nemoralis, a small goldenrod that grows only in prairies. The Grindelia as well. Again, these are mostly prairie-only plants. You're not going to see them anywhere else besides for in these soils. And so here's a prairie opening that is associated with that particular site. And so these are two rhetorical questions. I don't know the answer to either one of these. This is Highway 12 in Starkville. Bob referred to it. This is my fear. You know, I don't find places like this particularly beautiful. I know that they are convenient. And so there are successes. In this particular case, botanist in Central Tennessee, L.C. Quarterman, found what was at the time thought to be an extinct coneflower that came to be known as Echinacea tennesseeensis. It had actually been recorded previously to her rediscovering it. That's how they knew, or that's how they came to think that it was extinct. And in her fieldwork as a botanist, she ended up finding numerous sites where, or let's say numerous, it's not particularly widespread even in the state of Tennessee, but because it was listed as extinct, and then she was able to, through working with universities, through working with her students, she was able to set aside areas so that this plant could have a place to be. And so, let's finally talk a little bit about gardening. And how can we bring this piece of place into our landscapes? When we garden with prairie plants in the state of Mississippi, largely our crop yields are going to come from someplace else. We are not going to have local ecotypes. We're going to be buying plants that come from seed or plants that were grown in Texas or Missouri or Illinois or Wisconsin or Pennsylvania or Kentucky. We are not, unless we grow them ourselves, unless we go out and either potentially, take a few from the side of the road, collect seed and grow it ourselves. There is really no source within our state for the plant materials that we would use to bring prairie into our garden. And that's a problem, as far as I'm concerned. We're not using our local ecotypes. We're losing genetic diversity. We're losing these prairie remnants, and on and on. And so we're not using local materials. So we need to develop those sources. And there are problems associated, it's very hard to find the time or to have the resources or to pay the cost associated with hand collecting seeds. We all maybe have the time to do that, but it's not really the case. So as gardeners, you can ask for, is this a Mississippi plant? Is this grown in Mississippi? If there is a demand, there will, in my mind, become a supply. And so, you can't really, I don't think you can necessarily have supply first. In that case, then you have to create demand. However, if demand is present, somebody will supply you with this resource. So if it's important to you to have local materials, you have to ask for local materials. That's one of the first things. So we have a number of prairie plots out on North Farm that we're basically trying to demonstrate the the uses of some of these plants, especially in the garden. And so we've demonstrated a number of different ways that we use them in the landscape, whether we, to see whether or not we can disperse them in, I'm very particularly interested in design using random assemblages, so trying to randomize the placement of these plants in the landscape, but also because that's a little bit different from our typical, when we see these types of plants, how do we usually see them in the landscape? When we see prairie plants and you think perennial gardening, how do you see them in the landscape? They're in drifts, right? We plant them all together. Okay, you'll see a little bit of that in nature, but not particularly always. And there tends to be a little bit more of a patchy, bit of a random assemblage. It's not random, but it looks random. And so that's something that we can experiment with in the landscape. And this is something that we've done on these particular plots. These plants are all placed randomly. There was no drift. There was no planting the same plant next to the other plant. And it becomes a little bit, I think, more natural in the end. Okay? The other thing that we have to manage, I'm getting my other picture up, is, and especially when we're managing prairie, is we have to manage it and think about our disturbance patterns. We disturb the landscape in a number of different ways. Prairie happens to be dependent upon disturbance, that being fire. It can also use mowing. It could also use grazing. It can also use disking. But it can't have too much. If you mow a site every month, you'll never have prairie. If you burn a site every month, you would never have prairie, or disc or graze it too much. You will never have prairie. This is why prairie is gone, is because we haven't managed our disturbance patterns very well. So we have to take into consideration how much, when, and what is the thing that I'm trying to get out of the other end. So always consider your disturbance patterns. So when we manage disturbance, we can manage it at very small scales where we're talking about pruning by hand and whether we're going to use mulch or not use mulch. Those are the decisions that we make in the garden. I personally think that mulch, if you're trying to get prairie, oftentimes what we're going for is having the plants in our garden reseed. And if you're a perennial garden, you know the value of reseeding in your perennial garden. But if we mulch, we're usually pretty much undoing the ability of a plant to reseed. So then we can't share with our friends, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we're trying to get plants with seeds in contact with the soil so mulch can undo that. If you are having a portion of your yard that would potentially go to prairie, then you have to rethink your mowing regime. You're not going to be able to mow every week and ever have prairie. The other thing that you might be able to ask yourself is, can I burn? Miss Betty, can I burn? Yeah, my yard, that's absolutely right. I have a feeling Mr. Jim would be out there with me if I did have a, which we'd probably get out of hand if me and Mr. Jim tried to burn anything. I have a feeling for sure it's gonna happen. But can you burn? That's a question. Okay? And there are places where you can, or you can at least simulate burning, and that can help you to spread your prairie. Then, as you move out and you have bigger scales, if you have fields under your control, or field borders in your agricultural lands under your control, then any number of other things become a part of what you can do to reestablish prairie. You can burn, and it is very cost effective, especially to many other disturbances. You can also mow, and you're going to have to think again about when you time that disturbance. If you mow in the summer, you're going to have a different set of prairie plants than if you mow in the winter. If you burn in the summer, you're going to get a different set of prairie plants than you're going to have if you burn in the winter. Okay? So all that has to be considered. These are a number of resources that I would hope that you would consider. Friends of Osborne Prairie is a local resource that we try to help as much as we possibly can. The Mississippi Natural Heritage Program is very interested in preserving and reestablishing prairie, especially if you have what might be a potential site on any of your properties. The Native Plant Society, Prairie Wildlife is an organization in West Point that is helping to establish, especially in agricultural lands, prairies, native grasses for wildlife usage. We have a new website that we're still developing, but getting more and more information on every day, called MississippiBlacklandPrairie.org. And if you do have lands that are available to the CRP program, then CP33 is part of that conservation reserve program that could help you reestablish prairie on your property. With that, I'm not sure how I was doing pretty good at keeping track of my time there for a little bit, but then I lost it. Or I lost track of my stopwatch, so I don't know how much time I've got.
Got time for questions?
Yeah, I was gonna, if there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer as many as I possibly could. Thank you for your time.
What success rate do you have in transplanting those plants?
98.
And you might repeat the question too.
Oh, yeah. She asked what the success rate in terms of transplanting those prairie plants. Now again, most of the plants that are on that particular site in North Varden, they actually came from Pennsylvania. But we want to have, in order to get the number of plants that we were looking for in terms of the space that we wanted, we would like actually to get all local sources, or all locals material out there. We will probably in time swap those out for local sources, but the success rate of the plants that we brought in is probably very close to 100%. They're actually, if they're in the right soil, they're more or less hard to kill, which is part of the beauty of them.
So if you had pasture land, you want to just let it grow?
Partly let it grow, see what comes up. Now, if you had pasture land in prairie, you'd want to know, are these soils right for prairie, which can be easily discerned. And then start thinking about when I mow or can I burn. Absolutely. And then
So the prairie needs to be some choppy.
prairie around here, it doesn't need to be chalky,
I mean, well,
but it needs to be probably underlain by chalk. It depends on what types of soil are laying over that chalky material. So you can have acid soils that aren't necessarily going to give you good prairie or as good a prairie, but you can just check the alkalinity. If you're anywhere near 7, you can probably have prairie.
I live next door in Winston County. Well,
Yep.
we've got some really clay.
Then you're probably going to have a tough time getting prairie. You could have another grassland, but you're not going to get this type of prairie. And again, there's a suite of species that are appropriate to that soil type too, and that is place. You know, that is the idea of place.
Has there been any coordination between the certified forestry program and the local genotypes?
The question is about
It's called certified.
certified forestry program. Not that I know of, and we've started. I've tried to talk more with the NRCS about local genotypes. They're interested mostly in producing large quantities of seed, and I think there might be some potential there, but we're kind of thinking more about producing more diversity of seed. Oh, go ahead.
I have a question.
Okay.
I'm a little confused. Most of the area around here is cropland. I mean, soybeans,
Correct.
and cotton and all that. Is that a different kind of soil than what?
Nope. Nope.
It's just that they've taken over the prairies to plant
Correct.
crops.
That's part of what I was talking about in terms of those original surveys. When those original surveys identified prairie, automatically it was an agricultural resource. And I think we should never abandon that. That too is a part of our ecological heritage. However, there are times and places where we can save prairie, where I think we probably haven't taken advantage of the ability to do so. You're right, and this will always be, and most grasslands in North America in general, will always be seen as an agricultural resource. And they will continue to be so, absolutely.
Okay, when you talk about burning,
Yes.
and you're asking this better, now,
Right.
if you were gonna burn it, how do you control it?
Okay, the first thing you gotta start with a fire break. So what you want to have a place where if your fire was, say, moving on this stage, this edge would be a fire break. I would know that I could stop it here. So there are a number of different ways to establish a fire break. You can do it with disking, you can just mow real close and you'll get that. You can actually burn yourself a fire break. So you always have to have a place where you know that you have an edge where it will stop. And there are contractors locally who can do this for you as well if you have large areas to burn. But small areas, as long as you generally, I've burned, experimentally, I've burned, plots that were a little bit smaller than this stage, and just weeded the ground right down to the almost as close as I could get to bare soil. I wrapped a ring of fire around there, and it all came to the middle, and had this gorgeous vortex going right up in the middle of it, like 10 feet high. But it stopped. It stayed right there. I mean, a perfect square. It can be done, and it can be done actually fairly easily. So the fire break is the key. Just knowing that you can stop it where you want it to stop. There are a number of other things. You got to watch out for canopy. When that thing goes 12 feet high, you don't want it hitting another tree. But you would want to hire, for larger areas, you would want to hire somebody who does it on a regular basis. For small plots, you can do things like just, burn some of your yard waste there, but just like you would do anything, establish a perimeter. Just like you would if you were going to burn the sticks out of your yard. And then just sort of watch how it travels. And then that will help you to establish prairie species for sure, especially in alkaline soils.
You can burn at the level of a single plant. And there's not just prairie plants, too. There's a number of plants that respond well to burning. I saw a presentation where a landscape architect talked about Santolina as a plant that is
benefits.
Good. Just set it on fire at the end of the year. So if you just had a muley grass or a panicum out there and you just want to burn that one plant, just sit there with a hose and make sure it doesn't burn anything else.
And absolutely, and most of these will have dry structures that can be set afire actually quite easily. Again, you don't want it spreading if you don't know that you can stop it. So that is the key, is just knowing where you can get it to stop. Ma'am?
Can plant wildflowers, the ground have to be this?
I think it needs to be, I don't know about disc. When you say planting wildflowers, you're talking about on a fairly large area or a small area?
Small area.
Small area, you could do it just with, I use a hula hoe. Is everybody familiar with a hula hoe? Which is a prairie gardener's best friend, honestly. It's called a stirrup hoe. It's a U-shaped hoe, which is very good for disturbing the soil just enough. Right now is the time to be getting prairie seed out and then looking for it to germinate either over the winter or early next spring. So if you're planting prairie seeds, first you need a little bit of an opening. You probably need the right soil, would help. And then just turn up enough of the ground to where you know you can get the seed to stay in contact with the soil and not wash away. And then look for it in the spring. And so you kind of got to know what that seedling is going to look like. And then a lot of things will bloom. Some will bloom in the first year, others you might have to wait until the second or third year before you actually get the bloom that you're looking for. What you're especially looking for is good seed to soil contact. Get the seed packed down into the soil, whether you till it up or not. You can do that with a boot heel. You can do it any number of ways. Just make sure you get that seed pressed firmly into the ground. And if you got the right soil, you almost can't go wrong.
Don't you have to have a permit to burn?
Yes, you do, especially on very large areas. However, I think for home use, I think that there's a lot of, I don't know that you have to have a permit to, say, burn yard waste.
We have an ordinance.
You have an ordinance against it. I think everybody's kind of going, well, yeah. So it's maybe small fires, but yes, absolutely. If you're burning on any kind of large acreage, you absolutely have to have a permit. And you should also, you have to be a certified burn manager for those larger areas. Absolutely.
We burn off-site patches for all kinds of different things.
Right.
Up where I live, we burn in the city of Richmond. And there for doctors. And create wildfire.
In Ridgeland? In Ridgeland.
And we had no problem with that. They only told us we had to get a receive their permit from the state.
Right.
And that's where the certification is.
Correct.
At certified burn station.
Right.
And we burned it, and Clark Partners said, you call them and tell them when we burn it. If they got any calls from smoke from plant
Right.
neighbors, they would come out and shut it down.
Right.
They did, and they just burned right.
Robert's talking about in the city of Ridgeland, he burns extensively for clients. You do have to have a permit. There does have to be a certified manager, and it's not a hard training to get. I still hold one myself. I haven't even used it in years. The permit process is actually fairly easily. You do it over the phone, and it's like. It's not that tough, to be able to do it, especially even on larger areas. Bob's definitely ready to move on. Thank you very much for your time.
See that I get to work with these really smart people. It's really great. I want to introduce Brian Templeton real quick. He just has a couple of programs he wants to mention, and we're going to take, right after that, about a half-hour break, so 11 o'clock we'll meet up right here. Barnes & Noble is not far. We've got coffee right outside, and please enjoy life. Oh, and if you all want to take a look at Carol's book that will be mentioned later, we have a copy up here if you'd like to take a look at it as well. Brian?
Hi, thanks everybody. Just want to mention that down at Crosby Arboretum next weekend, the 27th, 28th, and 29th, Pat Drackett, myself, and Lily Kelly, and Victor Maddox, and maybe a few other people are going to be directing a landscape design short course. The cost is $50 if you want to join. I think there's about 5 seats still open, so if you are interested, please act quickly. Basically, you don't have to have any knowledge or any materials. You just show up, and we're going to teach you as much as we can in the short time we have about landscape design. It would be Thursday and Friday nights from 6 to 9 p.m. and Saturday from 9 to 3 p.m. And we'll give you lunch on that Saturday, and we'll have snacks and some other things. With the fee that you pay, aside from the instruction, we'll also be providing you with some materials that we use in the trade that we think might be helpful for you. And basically, on Saturday, we're going to ask you to bring in a little piece of your yard, not your entire yard, and we will actually help you work on designing that portion of your yard and to try and teach you how to scale that up so you can take that one little portion that we help you with and take that to the other areas of your yard or the area that you're interested in. Are there any questions about that program?
Brochures are outside.
There are some brochures outside now. We didn't have any this morning, but there are some now if you're interested. And then the other program, there were brochures out earlier. Mr. Bobby Ward, who is an author and botanist from North Carolina, will be here speaking on campus on November 4th. It'll be at Tully Auditorium in Thompson Hall, which is the forestry building. That's going to be a free presentation sponsored by Department of Landscape Architecture and Plant and Soil Sciences, if Dr. Phillips is here. And then Mr. Ward will also be at Crosby the following day, the 5th, if anybody is from the south part of the state and would prefer to see him there. Pat, do you have the
That'll
details?
be 10 o'clock at the Crosby Memorial Library downtown in Picayune.
10 o'clock at the Crosby Library in downtown Picayune on Saturday, November 5th, if you prefer to see him there. Any questions about that?
What time on the 4th?
The 4th is from 10 to 11.
Brian, I will
Yes,
say, the Crosby lecture is on southeastern wildflowers. The one he has here is on the plant.
That's right. It is actually, he's speaking on a different topic at both lectures. That's right. So this lecture here is on plant hunters, contemporary plant hunters, people who actually go out searching for plants to bring into the ornamental horticulture trade. And his speech on Saturday at Crosby is on wildflowers of the southeast. Thank you.
All right, we're going to meet back here at 11. Thank y'all.